I took my assignment as the Secretary General's Special Envoy for Yemen and began on the 11th of March. I approached this with gratitude to the Secretary General for his trust and a sense of privilege that I might get the chance to do something to bring this great tragedy to a belated end. Privileged, coupled, I hope, with due humility in the face of the complexity and urgency of the challenge. In the days since, those original feelings have, if anything, become stronger. I have been privileged to meet and to be guided by a wealth of Yemenis. These come from all the parties and from many civic organizations. I have taken up the time of leaders and listened as eagerly to the views of the less fortunate. As is always the case from my own experience, it has been the women who I have met and who have spoken to me, who have often spoken with the greatest clarity, as well as with the generosity that is necessary about those they fear, as well as about those they support. Public comment on Yemen, like on any other international tragedy, is copious and sadly often vituperative. The rhetoric on Yemen is perhaps understandably unforgiving and unsparing. I know, as you do, that peace becomes possible when we see the good in our foes, even though we can see clearly the cruelties of war. My emphasis on listening to and engaging Yemenis above all other priorities is not an idle decision. We know that resolving Yemen's conflict may only come from an agreement among its leaders to put aside their differences and for them to agree to deal with them, not through battle, but through dialogue and debate. To put Yemenis first, therefore, is not merely proper and right, it is the only way we will find peace. In my experience of trying to resolve conflicts, I've learned to take people at their word. To trust, yes, but also to verify. We should take on trust the assurances we hear, even as we know that the ultimate test is what they will deliver in practice. So when I hear positive words from one leader or another, often instantly the cause of derision or skepticism from the other side, my line is, let us take these good words and put them to good use. My report to you today, Mr. President, is a preliminary one. I will tell you what I know and also what I fear, and I will also try to identify signs of hope. My plan is to put to this Council within the next 2 months a framework for negotiations. Mr. President, there is good news and bad news, and I apologize for this cliché, but it is the truth. The good news, and this is my principal message to the members of the Council today, is that a political solution to end this war is indeed available. Its outlines are no secret. The end of fighting, the withdrawal of forces and handover of heavy weapons in key locations, together with an agreement on the establishment of an inclusive government, one which brings the parties together in a consensus to build peace. This can be done. All those with whom I spoke, from the widest range of the Yemeni political spectrum, have told me that they want this, that they want it quickly, that they will work with the United Nations to achieve it, and that they are conscious of the consequence, as in all agreements between enemies, that mutual concessions will be required. Let me emphasize, however, that a successful outcome of negotiations, never to be guaranteed, will require patience, diligence, and good faith between the parties. I have come to this general conclusion by listening to the leaders of the parties. I have assured them that what the Secretary-General wishes and what this Council requires is also what all Yemenis want, a stable and secure Yemen with a government accountable to its citizens. I am grateful to President Hadi for his time, his patience, and his willingness to put the concerns of his people first. His government has spared no effort to ensure I understand their positions, their needs, and their willingness to engage. I count on their support, which is essential for the success of this endeavour. I was also encouraged by my meeting with the leadership of the Ansar Allah movement in Sana'a. They assured me that their movement wants an end to this war and will cooperate with the United Nations to make this happen. This message was also repeated to me in several other encounters I was privileged to have with other senior Ansar Allah leaders. I'm greatly encouraged by this constructive attitude. I've heard similar views from the leaders of an exceptionally wide variety of Yemeni political parties, and I'm grateful to them too. I have not yet visited the south, but I have started to meet southern groups. The conflict has, as you can imagine, brought about major changes on the ground in the southern governorates and has made the long-standing frustrations and aspirations of southerners more prominent. There will be no peace in Yemen if we do not also listen to the voices of the south and make sure they're included in the political arrangements that end this war. Mr. President, it is no surprise that stopping a war is not at all the same as building peace. And so it goes in Yemen. We must first turn our energies to the business of stopping the war. The parties necessary for this task, this specific task, are those whose decisions can contribute to bringing an end to this war. And I have been consistent in delivering the same message to them, that that is the first task. A negotiated political settlement through inclusive intra-Yemeni dialogue is the only way to end the Yemeni conflict and address the ongoing humanitarian crisis in an ultimate form. And to this end, all parties to the conflict need to abandon preconditions to talks and grant my office unhindered, unconditional access to all relevant stakeholders, as indeed this Council asserted in the last presidential statement in March this year. Building peace, however, as always, will be a much larger task, based on different precedents and a broader participation. The national dialogue, with its impressive record of inclusion and of civic participation, will be a decisive precedent. This will be the agenda of transition, to include reconciliation, the first item that requires our attention at the end of a conflict, constitutional review, reconstruction, and the rebuilding of state institutions. This is about, therefore, transforming the state. Making this work will require the full involvement of civil society to ensure that the process goes beyond politics and it reflects the aspirations of all Yemenis. Mr. President, I said there was good news, but also bad news. There is a saying that the darkest hour is the one that comes before dawn, and let us hope that this is the case. It will not be news to you, sir, or the members of this Council, that the war has, if anything, become louder and more pressing these last few weeks. I'm concerned about the increased number of ballistic missiles launched towards Saudi Arabia, and I note that this Council has already pronounced on this. In addition, I'm concerned about the intensified military operations in Sada Governorate. Military confrontations and airstrikes have continued in numerous other areas of Yemen, including Sana'a, Taiz, Al-Jawf, Marib, Al-Hodeida, Hajja, Al-Baida, and large governorates. The clashes continue without major changes in the front lines, but with disturbing reports of civilian casualties. We also, and this is an issue of great importance to us, hear unconfirmed reports that movements of forces in Yemen are on the increase, and that the prospect of intensive military operations in Al-Hodeida, long heralded, may soon be forthcoming. Our concern is simple, that any of these developments would, at a single stroke, take peace off the table. I'm convinced there's a real danger of this. We all need, urgently and creatively, to find ways to diminish the chances of these game-changing events, upsetting and derailing the very real hopes of the great majority of Yemenis. The people of Yemen are in desperate need of signs of hope that this war will soon end. Apart from the urgent requirement for unlimited humanitarian access, as I'm sure Mark will be referring to in a minute, there are other measures that may provide some hope. We have, for example, and with the encouragement of political leaders from all sides, been working to get Sana'a airport opened again for air traffic and for the right of Yemenis to travel and to rejoin their families. We're also eager to arrange the release and exchange of prisoners, and both sides have told me that they would like to see all prisoners released. I'm very encouraged by this, and we'll do all we can to make it happen, and we will report back to you on progress. We're also very concerned on the issue of detentions by all sides. We know from experience elsewhere that the arbitrary and widespread detention of civilians in armed conflict is both a terrible abuse, but also a fundamental impediment to the recovery of a stable society and the need for reconciliation, which is so central to peace. These are important issues, confidence-building issues as they're referred to. Even more important, if I may, is the heroic work being done daily by humanitarian agencies in Yemen under the leadership of Mark and of my good friend and colleague Lise Grandi. The members of this Council know better than I do the strategic importance of stability in Yemen. This is of primary importance for its people, for its neighbours, and for the wider international community. This can only be achieved by ensuring a stable Yemen, where finally terrorist activity can be focused on and eliminated, and where the safety of the sea lanes can be relied upon. Making this happen requires an effective synergy between mediation, where I have a role, and diplomacy, where you do. Mediation without the backing of diplomacy will certainly fail. We will do whatever we can to find agreements that work between Yemenis, but it is for the members of this Council and other member states from time to put the force of international opinion behind these agreements. And your unity, sir, and your resolve will be decisive. Thank you very much.
Yemen remains the world's worst humanitarian crisis. 3/4 of the population, more than 22 million people, urgently require some form of humanitarian help, including 8.4 million people who struggle to find their next meal. The crisis is overwhelming families and institutions and is now affecting nearly every sector and every aspect of Yemeni life. With swift and joint action, conditions for the Yemeni people can improve. On the political front, you've just heard from Martin, the Secretary-General's Special Envoy. Mr. President, humanitarian agencies have scaled up assistance and strengthened their capacity in Yemen. The relief operation is one of the largest and most complex in the world. 190 partners, most of them Yemeni organizations, get help to millions of people in thousands of locations every single month. Last year, we increased the coverage of food assistance from 3 million people a month in January to more than 7 million a month in December. For 2018, the World Food Programme have plans to reach 10 million people a month. And we're doing the same thing in other sectors, including water, health, sanitation, and other core services. The humanitarian operation in Yemen is already one of the largest in the world. We've 5 humanitarian hubs in place to coordinate assistance across the country, and we're exploring opening more, including in Marib and Mukalla. Every week, dozens of humanitarian movements, including food convoys, and hundreds of specific humanitarian locations are deconflicted by the parties to the conflict. We're able to reach people in all 333 districts, and in each district, we aim to collect data on how many people receive aid every month. Mr. President, earlier this month, Sweden, Switzerland and the Secretary-General co-chaired a pledging conference for Yemen. In the words of the Secretary-General, quote, "It was a remarkable success of international solidarity. 40 member states and regional organizations pledged more than $2 billion. Thank you for that generosity. Allow me particularly to recognize the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates for their $930 million contribution to the humanitarian response plan. This was not just an exceptionally large contribution. It was also prompt, swift, unearmarked, and unconditional, and it has already been fully dispersed. Mr. President, all parties to the conflict must take practical steps to protect civilians and facilitate humanitarian access in line with their obligations under international humanitarian law. The record on this issue remains mixed. There have been improvements. UN humanitarian flights and vessels are moving regularly. That is positive. But we remain very concerned about commercial imports through all of Yemen's ports, most particularly Hodeida and Salif. Before the war, Yemen relied on imports to cover 90% of staple foods and nearly all its medicine and fuel needs. Commercial shortages and delays at ports have led to sharp increases in the price of food and household necessities. Ports are the lifeline of Yemen. We're doing our part to ensure they can function properly. I'm pleased to confirm that steps are being taken to further strengthen the UN verification and inspection mechanism, which screens commercial shipments to Hodeida and Salif ports. We're encouraging all those concerned to accelerate the normalization of commercial shipments into Hodeida and Salif, as well as to Yemen's other ports. We are worried that shipping companies are reluctant to enter Yemeni waters. The reasons are related to problems with foreign exchange and the banking sector, as well as the ports. But the result is that insufficient food is being imported, and that needs to be addressed. Price increases, especially of food, are forcing hundreds of thousands of destitute families to turn to humanitarian assistance for their very survival. We're also concerned that Sana'a Airport remains closed to commercial traffic, preventing thousands of critically ill patients from travelling abroad to seek treatment unavailable in Yemen. And on several occasions over the last month, military activities conducted in the proximity of the airport have affected humanitarian flights. Last week, there were serious incidents close to humanitarian locations which had been deconflicted. We're working closely with all parties to ensure that they are not repeated. Within Yemen, bureaucratic impediments imposed by decision makers in Sana'a are affecting relief operations. Humanitarian staff continue to face delays in visas and project approvals, restrictions on imports and customs clearance, and long delays in searches at checkpoints. In recent weeks, some parts of the media in Sana'a have depicted humanitarian operations inaccurately and unjustly, and humanitarian staff have been detained. We're also concerned about insecurity in parts of the country, particularly in the south. While we have access, in part, to all of Yemen's 333 districts, restrictions and insecurity mean that an estimated 1.2 million people in need of assistance live in areas inaccessible to humanitarian organizations. All impediments which prevent humanitarians from reaching people must stop. Mr. President, looking ahead, we still face enormous challenges. Unless steps are taken now in high-risk districts, we risk another major cholera outbreak. Last year's outbreak of cholera and watery diarrhea struck more than 1 million people. The effects continue to linger. As we enter the rainy season, the conditions that created this outbreak are still present. Applying the lessons from last year, we're doing everything we can to respond. Agencies are pre-positioning supplies, chlorinating water sources, and launching a vaccination campaign. As with other challenges, a successful response requires safe, unimpeded and unhindered access across and into Yemen for humanitarian staff and humanitarian supplies. We need predictable fuel imports to keep hospitals and water treatment plants running. Yemeni public servants, who are doing so much themselves to prepare for and respond to the crisis, need their salaries paid. Most health and sanitation workers have still not been paid for more than a year and a half. The impact of airstrikes, shelling and fighting on the civilian population, particularly in Hodeida, Taiz, Sadr, Hadramaut and Hajar governorates, is deeply worrying. Civilian lives are lost, public infrastructure is destroyed, displacement is increasing. Mines and the remnants of war affect agricultural production and the wider economy, as well as threatening civilian life. Some 3 million women and girls are at risk of sexual and gender-based violence. Like Martin, I also remain very concerned about missiles being launched into Saudi Arabia from within Yemen. This adds a further dimension to the civil war and puts many civilians at great risk. I want to remind all parties that they have obligations under international humanitarian law. Restraint is needed to avoid any escalation which would worsen still further the suffering of ordinary people. Mr. President, while the humanitarian response can do and is doing a lot, it cannot resolve this crisis. I therefore echo the Special Envoy's call, Martin's call, for all parties to engage meaningfully with the United Nations without preconditions to achieve a lasting negotiated settlement towards a sustainable peace. Thank you.
It's a desperate situation, Mr. President, and it is clear, as the Special Envoy set out, it can only be resolved ultimately through a political solution. I think we all agree on that. I think what the Under-Secretary-General said about the humanitarian consequences, and particularly 8 million people being close to starvation and 1 million people at risk of cholera and similar illnesses, is absolutely shocking, and that ought to be a spur to action for the Council. I think the international community must do whatever we can to enable the Special Envoy to develop his plan at the pace that he has just outlined to us. And I just want to say I really welcome the clarity and the elements of that plan that he set out. I hope we can, as an international community, pool all our influence and urge the parties to engage in good faith with the UN process. Although the conflict has some quite desperate humanitarian consequences, this is a solvable conflict. I think the Under-Secretary-General said if we had swift and joint action, Mr. President, then we can make some very good progress. So I think that's absolutely where we should put our efforts. And as a Council, I hope that we can encourage people to grant full and unhindered access to Yemen for the Special Envoy, for his team, for the humanitarian actors. And in that respect, the meetings that the Envoy laid out in the region, including in Sana'a with senior Houthi leaders, are extremely welcome. I'd like, if I may, just to highlight a couple of areas for specific immediate action. The Under-Secretary-General mentioned financial pledges, and I agree the scale of the generosity from Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Kuwait are all quite remarkable. We ourselves, as the United Kingdom, have provided $250 million for this year and next. I think we all know that money alone won't be enough. We do need to do more to get commercial supplies in. And I was concerned about the foreign exchange problem, Mr. President, because in Yemen, a lot of the food and supplies that go in need to come from commercial sources. Humanitarian assistance can't manage the scale required. Commercial shipping needs to be able to go in, and this is vital to water and sanitation systems. So I do hope we can all find ways to urge collaboration on that. I think the second point is around access to Houthi-controlled areas, where we see very many severely malnourished children. We had a presidential statement in March that highlighted the importance of vaccination campaigns, campaigns, as the Under-Secretary General said. And then I think, thirdly, I just want to echo the call about paying non-military public workers. Families don't have the means to buy food, they don't have the means to buy medicine, and half of the health facilities have closed. So this is all contributing to a more desperate situation in Yemen than needs to be objectively the case. I also would now like to turn to regional stability. The impact on regional stability of this conflict is growing and it's dangerous. It puts Saudi Arabia at risk, it puts Saudi citizens at risk. The continued Houthi missile attacks, including the use of ballistic missiles at civilian targets in Saudi Arabia, attract our outright condemnation. Deliberate targeting of civilian areas is abhorrent. It is against international law, against international humanitarian law. We call on all parties involved in the conflict to abide by their international humanitarian law obligations. And as the Under-Secretary General set out, this is still not being done to a sufficient degree. But I also want to stress that it really is a national security threat to Saudi Arabia, and this in turn is driving renewed conflict on the ground. So it is vital, and I hope the Council can help with this, that all Member States fully implement the arms embargo that the Council has laid down. In particular, the UN panel of experts has concluded that missiles and related material of Iranian origin has been introduced into Yemen after the imposition of the targeted arms embargo. That in turn means Iran is in non-compliance with Security Council Resolution 2216. So we strongly urge Iran to desist from destabilising activity, and we encourage all Member States to use whatever influence they have to ensure that the supply of missiles fueling the conflict inside Yemen stops. Mr. President, I really do want to stress something the Special Envoy said about this being possible to make progress. We have within our grasp the ability to really do something to help bring this conflict to an end. I think that's a very important contribution that the Council can make for regional and international peace and security at a time when we see so many problems on so many other issues. So I would like to conclude, Mr. President, by urging all members of the Council really to put our shoulders to the wheel to support the UN and try and bring peace to Yemen. Thank you.
I would like to begin by welcoming the Special Envoy Martin Griffiths to the Council for the first time in his new role. And let me thank you for your very clear briefing this morning. We share your deep concern about the risks for escalation, but we also see the opportunities that you outlined. As you pointed to, the stakes are high in Yemen, whether regards to the humanitarian situation, the regional stability, or the spread of terrorism. And I would like to encourage you to continue to reach out to those strong and clear women that you referred to. It's clear to us that women's active participation in the peace process will be decisive. I also wish to thank Under-Secretary General Lowcock for his briefing today, as well as for his efforts to address the humanitarian situation in Yemen and ensure that it remains high on our and the international community's agenda. I will focus on 2 points in my intervention. Firstly, the political situation and the need to strongly support the resumption of a UN-led political process. And secondly, the humanitarian situation and the need to implement the March presidential statement. First, on the political situation. The appointment of Special Envoy Martin Griffiths offers an opportunity to relaunch the political process in Yemen. It is essential that the Council now unites in giving the Special Envoy our strong support and that we stay focused on making use of this opportunity. The members of the Council and regional actors must now use all their influence to ensure that all parties engage with the Special Envoy and that the UN-led process in good faith and without preconditions. We encourage the parties to now move forward quickly on confidence-building measures, such as those related to Sana'a Airport and the release of prisoners. It also seems clear that the southern question will need to be addressed in these discussions. Mr. Griffin, you have been off to a very good start to your challenging task. We are encouraged by your early visit to Yemen and the region and fully support the efforts to pursue broad consultations with an inclusive approach. Full and unhindered access to all relevant parties in Yemen is critical. Mr. President, now moving to the humanitarian situation. On March 15, this Council unanimously agreed a statement recognizing the vast humanitarian needs and the immediate steps that must be taken to alleviate the suffering of the Yemeni people. These steps were based on the parties' obligations to respect international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. But regrettably, implementation of this strong and clear statement from the Council is clearly lacking. Restrictions, delays, and uncertainty at ports such as Hodeida and Salif hinder humanitarian and commercial imports. Delays and obstacles to the UNVIM clearance process for vessels continue and have a deterrent effect on private shipping companies. Even when supplies do reach the country, access within the country remains a serious challenge due to the many bureaucratic impediments and checkpoints. And to date, no humanitarian evacuations, even for emergency treatment, have been allowed through Sana'a Airport. Strikes on civilians and civilian infrastructure continue from all sides. We have seen renewed missile attacks from Houthi-held territory targeting Saudi Arabia, which our Foreign Minister has strongly condemned. Clearly, the violations of international humanitarian law continue, and accountability for such violations remain. It is time to move from words to action on Yemen. Time for this Council to demand that its decisions are implemented in full. It is time to actively and urgently engage the parties to ensure that the Council's will is heeded. Mr. President, Sweden's Special Envoy for Yemen, Ambassador Peter Semneby, visited Sana'a and Aden in late March. While there, he met with representatives of the Yemeni government, the Houthis, the General People's Congress, and the Southern Transitional Council. He also met with international, regional, and local civil society organizations, as well as internally displaced persons and other victims of the conflict. During his visit, Ambassador urged parties to engage with the UN-led process and to respect international humanitarian law, including protecting civilians and eliminating all obstacles to humanitarian assistance. We can say that the presidential statements provided by this Council is a good basis for such discussions and should be used by all members of this Council. Despite the many and well-known challenges in its meetings, the parties show the same signs of increased willingness to engage in the UN-led process that Mr. Martin referred to earlier today. We must really use this momentum. Mr. President, as one of the co-hosts of the high-level pledging event for Yemen in Geneva on 3rd April, we wish to join USG LOCOC in thanking all those donors who participated, resulting in pledges of over $2 billion to the UN Humanitarian Response Plan. The pledges made by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates will contribute significantly to the implementation of the UN Emergency Response Plan. We now call on all donors to make their disbursement as soon as possible. The panel discussion on humanitarian access that formed part of this conference demonstrated with clarity how difficult it is for UN agencies and other humanitarian actors to operate in Yemen. And it is clear that without addressing this fundamental issue, the funds raised will not be able to reach those in need as effectively as they should. Mr. President, in conclusion, the presidential statement by this Council on 15 March was our strongest yet on the humanitarian situation in Yemen. It reflected the urgency on the ground, but over 1 month later, this urgency remains. We must make every effort to ensure implementation, while at the same time supporting the Special Envoy. The desperate situation in Yemen demands greater attention by the international community, and this Council should further step up its efforts in the coming weeks and months to provide united support. I thank you.
Today I'd like to focus on three aspects: the peace process, the enduring humanitarian crisis, and the need to address Yemen's economic challenges. Mr. President, firstly, regarding the political process, 2018 could be a crucial year. And a new envoy brings with it opportunities for renewed dialogue that is so desperately needed as we move into the conflict's fourth year. And it's up to all parties to the conflict to seize these opportunities and do so without preconditions. We condemn the continued launching of ballistic missiles by the Houthis and call on all parties to the conflict to refrain from taking steps that would lead to further escalation. We welcome the Special Envoy's extensive and inclusive outreach in his first weeks in office, during which he spoke to Yemenis from all sides of the conflict, as well as countries in the region. And I'd like to particularly welcome, as you said, including women in this outreach as well. We strongly support this inclusive approach and call on all parties to allow full access to the envoy. In absence of a ceasefire, the impact of hostilities on civilians remain of great concern. Human rights violations and violations of international humanitarian law are reported too often. We once again urgently call for full compliance with international humanitarian law by all parties to the conflict. And as the war drags on, the need for accountability becomes ever more prominent. Without it, a negotiated political settlement has little chance of sustaining itself. Mr. President, secondly, in the absence of a political settlement, we call the Council's attention to the humanitarian crisis. And the pledging of $2 billion at the Humanitarian Conference in Geneva is a positive step. We welcome the quick disbursement of the generous pledge of almost $1 billion by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. We call on all member states to follow and disperse their pledges as soon as possible. At the same time, pledges mean little if access is not ensured. We call for the full implementation of the presidential statement of the 15th of March, particularly this Council's clear call for a full and sustained opening of all Yemen's ports to both humanitarian and commercial goods. It is deeply worrying that commercial food imports are still not at the level of before the blockade was imposed in November 2017. At the start of 2018, 8.4 million people were severely food insecure and at risk of starvation, a 24% increase since 2017. The United Nations Verification and Inspection Mechanism, UNVIM, has a crucial role to play in restoring confidence of commercial shippers that have stayed away since the start of the blockade. UNVIM has our full support, and we welcome recent steps taken to address this issue. And it is equally important that goods that have entered Yemen reach the people who need them most. Unimpeded access throughout Yemen is essential, and unnecessary bureaucratic impediments should be removed by all parties. Mr. President, my third point is regarding the economy. Yemen can't survive on humanitarian aid alone. And due to inflation and loss of income for many Yemenis, access to commercially available supplies is rapidly decreasing. It is essential that public sector salaries are paid across Yemen, not only to provide income for millions of Yemenis in need, but also to enable the resumption of essential public services, especially in the health and sanitation sectors. With summer approaching, the threat of a renewed cholera outbreak makes this issue even more pressing. Mr. President, in conclusion, the following steps need to be taken by all parties to the conflict. To prevent further escalation and engage with the new envoy without preconditions, to allow full and sustained humanitarian and commercial access into Yemen as well as throughout Yemen, and to take urgent steps to resume the payment of salaries and restore public services. After more than 3 years of conflict, the Yemeni people deserve nothing less than our maximum efforts. Thank you very much.
We commend the sterling contribution of OCHA and WHO, especially for providing increased medical supplies and rendering life-saving services and surgical procedures. Kazakhstan reiterates its support for the selfless commitment of OCHA and other humanitarian organizations to ease the suffering of the Yemeni people in their present difficult and challenging circumstances. Since the start of this month, humanitarian partners have reached about 60,000 people with emergency assistance and response. Over 2 million people still remain displaced across the country due to the conflict, 90% of whom fled their homes more than a year ago. It is necessary to increase the humanitarian emergency aid and provide unhindered access to all areas of Yemen. We emphasize that all obligations under international humanitarian law must be respected by all parties and take responsibility to mitigate the humanitarian situation by cooperating fully with UN and relevant humanitarian organizations. The large-scale vaccinations to control the spread of diphtheria in Yemen is by WHO, UNICEF and health authorities is noteworthy. This campaign targeted nearly 2.7 million children aged 6 weeks to 15 years in 11 governorates. As of 1st of March this year, the World Food Programme had reached over 6 million people with emergency food assistance. Safe drinking water for nearly 2 million people by rehabilitating urban water systems and rural water schemes was provided, with water trucked to nearly 375,000 of the most vulnerable IDPs. My delegation welcomes the decision of the coalition to keep open all Yemeni main ports, including Hodeida and Salif, that would allow humanitarian commercial cargo without restrictions, similar to how it was importing 90% of its staple food. Maintaining the flow of these imports is absolutely essential for humanitarian cases. On the political track, we are alarmed by the resurgence of the hostile situation in Yemen, particularly in Yemen's southern Hodeida governorate, about 100 kilometers south of Hodeida port, and the Saada governorate in northern Yemen. Airstrikes and clashes are also intensified in the neighboring Al-Jaf governorate. Kazakhstan therefore calls on all parties to commit themselves to establish a new regime for the cessation of hostilities. Such temporary respite would enable the population and create conditions for the resumption of negotiations. It is obvious that solving all outstanding issues and stabilizing the country will require many years of additional effort and involvement of the international community. However, the cessation of hostilities will provide an opportunity to revive the economy, resolve the humanitarian crisis, and restore basic public services to the population, which has been severely affected over the past 3 years. Achieving this goal should be a priority for the Council. In general, the Security Council should work more resolutely to resolve the Yemeni conflict and consider the situation in the context of stabilizing the situation in the entire region, as well as combating terrorism and the humanitarian mission to preserve the lives of civilians and to withdraw the country from the state of war. A key role in this belongs to the Special Envoy. We have repeatedly said that a balanced external support for a settlement in Yemen could effectively complement the work of the Special Envoy. The search for a peaceful resolution of the conflict through dialogue and confidence-building measures should be intensified, and an urgent universal ceasefire must be reached without preconditions. It will not be possible to achieve a victory by military means exclusively. It is necessary to prevent the emerging split of the country. All parties in Yemen need to find compromises and reject unilateral decisions that could harm the peace process. At the same time, we think that the parties to the conflict are obliged to refrain from committing acts that lead to an escalation of regional situation and security. It is not acceptable to strike rocket attacks against civilian targets on the territory of Saudi Arabia, which Kazakhstan strongly condemns. All parties should exercise restraint amid mounting tensions, and military escalation is not a solution. Yemen is the world's worst humanitarian crisis, with more than 22 million people, 3/4 of the population, in need of humanitarian aid and protection. In such critical conditions, it is important that the UN has started a plan for further actions. We were glad that in Geneva, in April 3rd, with the generous contributions from Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates and Kuwait, and over than 30 other countries, more than 2 billion were pledged to support the humanitarian response in Yemen. Kazakhstan was also a part of this effort. We endorse SG's opinion that humanitarian resources are very important, but they're not enough. It is essential that they reach the people in need. Lastly, we also call upon the parties to the conflict to demonstrate sincerity and flexibility, to avoid disagreements in the course of consultations, and to properly resolve complex issues, in particular withdrawal of forces, disarmament, and the formation of a government of a national consent, in order to achieve a comprehensive settlement taking into account the national conditions in Yemen and the concerns of all parties. We fully agree with the words of Secretary General that a negotiated political settlement through inclusive intra-Yemeni dialogue is the only solution. I thank you.
Mr. President, I would like first to underline the urgent need for resumption of the political process in Yemen. Poland is deeply convinced that the primary responsibility of this Council is to pave the way for a peaceful solution of the conflict. Let me echo what has been said by many speakers. Only a genuine, inclusive, intra-Yemeni political process can bring a long-standing peace in Yemen and put an end to the tremendous suffering of civilians who continue to bear the brunt of the ongoing hostilities. We perceive the assumption of the office by Mr. Griffiths as a unique opportunity to resume peace negotiations, which should be carried out with a full participation of all relevant parties and stakeholders, as well as all groups of Yemeni society, including women and youth. We encourage regional actors with influence on the parties to the conflict to convince them to engage constructively with Mr. Griffiths and his office and to participate in the UN-led process in good faith and without preconditions. Mr. President, let me turn to the humanitarian situation. I would like to express Poland's highest appreciation for the governments of Sweden and Switzerland, who together with the United Nations hosted the high-level pledging event for Yemen earlier this month. As other members of the Council, we welcome the outcome of this event, which confirmed the commitment of the international community to alleviate the suffering of the Yemeni people. Mr. President, as we have heard from Mr. Mark Lowcock, despite some positive developments, the humanitarian situation in Yemen remains desperate. The widespread fighting, severe economic decline, and food insecurity continue to take an enormous toll on population. We believe that to improve the situation of civilians, it is essential to ensure the public sector salaries to be paid across Yemen in order to enable the resumption of essential public services, including healthcare and education. Sustained deliveries of humanitarian and commercial goods, including food, fuel, and medical imports, must be guaranteed. Therefore, we urge all parties to the conflict to comply fully with the provisions of the Security Council Presidential Statement adopted by the Council on March 15, and to ensure that all Yemen's ports remain open and fully functional. We also urge the parties to facilitate access for humanitarian operations across the whole Yemeni territory. Mr. President, with regard to the ongoing hostilities in Yemen, we once again call upon the parties to refrain from taking actions that might lead to the escalation of fighting. Poland strongly condemns all indiscriminate attacks, including airstrikes, which have a disastrous impact on civilians in Yemen. We condemn equally strongly ballistic missiles attacks carried out by the Houthis against Saudi Arabia. All parties are obliged under the international humanitarian law to ensure the protection of civilians and humanitarian infrastructure. We also call upon all sides to fully cooperate with the group of international and regional eminent experts on Yemen to allow it a comprehensive examination of all alleged human rights violations and abuses. Finally, we reiterate the call for cessation of hostilities to be introduced in Yemen. Thank you, Mr. President.
We thank Special Envoy Martin Griffiths for his maiden briefing. We congratulate him on his appointment and express our support to him as he embarks on his heavy responsibilities of facilitating a diplomatic solution for the Yemeni crisis. We are encouraged to note that he has already started engaging with the parties and building the necessary cooperative relationships that would be imperative to reinvigorate the political process. Listening to the views of the Yemenis themselves is indeed absolutely important. We recognize that the crisis in Yemen requires a high sense of urgency, but we also believe that support, understanding, and patience from all parties, including this Council, is needed so that the new envoy would formulate a comprehensive way forward that could be effective in ending the conflict. This, the Special Envoy also emphasized in his briefing, and we look forward to the new framework for negotiation, which he plans to present in the coming 2 months. We also thank USG Mark Lowcock for his briefing, and we reiterate our appreciation to the UN and its humanitarian partners for their continued selfless service to provide aid under difficult conditions. As the war enters its 4th year, we remain deeply concerned about the multifaceted and complex crisis in Yemen, which continues to have devastating impact on civilians. In this regard, we appreciate the UN as well as the governments of Sweden and Switzerland for hosting a high-level pledging event in Geneva on the 3rd of April 2018. We also thank all donors for pledging to provide more than $2 billion. We hope the funds pledged would be dispersed rapidly to finance the Yemen 2018 Humanitarian Response Plan. As mentioned by the UN Secretary General and USG Lowcock during this event, in addition to finance, the success of the plan to reach out to all Yemenis in need of aid requires safe, unimpeded, and sustained humanitarian access. We still believe that the only solution to the Yemeni crisis is a peaceful and inclusive Yemeni-led political process that meets the legitimate demands and aspirations of the Yemeni people in full respect to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the country. We also believe the concerns of countries of the region needs to be addressed. In this regard, we reiterate our support to the March 15 presidential statement and the March 28 press statement, which enabled the Council to speak with one voice, underscoring, among others, the need for all parties to return to dialogue as the only means of delivering a negotiated political settlement. We call on all parties to fully implement them and engage constructively with Special Envoy Griffiths to resume political dialogue and agree on cessation of hostilities. They should seize the appointment of the new envoy as an opportunity and demonstrate the necessary political will to work with him towards reaching a deal, which he said today is possible, and bring an end to the war. Finally, we believe the international solidarity demonstrated during the pledging event should also be repeated to find a durable political solution to end the worst humanitarian tragedy of our time. We cannot agree more with what the Special Envoy said with regard to the strategic importance of ending the crisis in Yemen, not only for the sake of Yemenis themselves, who have endured so much over the past 4 years, but also for the sake of peace and stability in the region and indeed the world. I thank you.